안녕하십니까? 2020 글로벌
Good
코리아
afternoon,
박람회
ladies and gentlemen.
컨퍼런스 세션 중 문화 관광 한류로
Now
열어가는
we're going
문화
to
협력의
have a
확대 진행을
session
맡은
on cultural
한국문화관광연구원의
cooperation based on
이관영입니다.
cultural
반갑습니다.
tourism and
오늘
Hallyu.
약 100분 동안 진행될 본
Thank you
세션에서는
for joining us for
한국어
this
교육,
session.
한류 성과,
Today in this session, we're going to
신남방
discuss
시대 관광 교류
Hallyu,
관련 주제로
Korean
발표
language
및 토론을
education, and
진행하도록
tourism
하겠습니다.
promotion. There will be
본격적인
3
발표와 토론에
presentations.
앞서
Before the
한국문화관광연구원
presentations and the discussion,
김대관 원장님을 모시고
I'd like to
기조
invite
강연을
President
듣도록
Kim
하겠습니다.
Dae-kwan of Korea Culture and Tourism
원장님을
Institute
무대로
for his
모십니다.
keynote presentation. Please welcome him with a big hand.
Good afternoon. As I've been introduced, I am Kim Dae-kwan, President of the Korea Culture and Tourism Institute. Pleased to meet you. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for your participation at this session under the title of Expansion of Cultural Cooperation based on Culture, Tourism, and Hallyu. Thank you very much for your participation, both online and offline. This conference deals with the post-COVID-19 era and the global solidarity and cooperation to follow. Due to COVID-19, we have seen numerous changes both home and abroad. Despite COVID-19, we have had excellent K disease control, showcasing the well-advanced health system, ICT, and mature citizenship. But at the same time, due to the severance of human ties, many people have experienced the corona blues. Early this year, Parasite by Bong Joon-ho has won 4 awards at the Oscar Award, and Dynamite and Life is Gone by BTS was ranked at the top chart in the US, and Korean TV dramas have received high rankings in the OTT platforms. And as you can see, despite the crisis, we have been able to enjoy the great achievements of the Korean wave. The cultural industry of Korea has been expanding to China, Japan, Southeast Asia, as well as the US and Europe under the name of the Korean wave. Currently, the word Hallyu, or the Korean wave, is not an unfamiliar term, but when we first started discussions on the Korean wave, we had much more negative perspective compared to positive evaluations, and people thought that the Korean wave would not be long-lived. This is because many people picture that culture flows from advanced countries to developed countries. We always believe that although we are a member of the OECD, we are not a full-grown advanced country, and we always see ourselves as behind Western countries. And so that is why we did not give high marks for the Korean wave. But unlike such expectations, during the last 20 years, we have seen amazing advancements in the Korean wave. The Korean wave is on par with the Hollywood movie Jurassic Park from 1993. Well, we always talked about how Jurassic Park is equal to export of 1.5 million cars, but now our Korean wave is worth even more than that. The Korean wave is now spreading into cosmetic surgery, fashion, and cosmetics. So you can see that all industries relevant to Hallyu celebrities, as well as learning the Korean language, traveling to Korea, are benefiting from the Korean wave. The Korean wave has also contributed to the image of Korea. We have been able to create a new national value as a cultural powerhouse. The new prestige of the Korean wave is not only the result by us, but it's actually a result by those who are enjoying the Korean wave. The Oscar Award for Parasite, the top song on Billboard by BTS, and the best TV drama dramas on Netflix being Korean are all results that we enjoy thanks to those who enjoy Korean culture around the world. In other words, the Korean wave is not the result of Korea alone, but rather it is becoming a medium for everyone to enjoy together. We did provide the contents and material, but in the end, it became a culture that the whole world enjoys together. And the enjoyment is not just of Korean contents. Jazz, SF, and reggae music are just some genres enjoyed by people around the world, and Korean wave has become one of those classifications. And therefore, we need renewed recognition and awareness of the Korean wave. And therefore, during this session, we would like to expand our view of the Korean wave to something that is being enjoyed by people around the world and something that connects people around the world. And therefore, we hope to view Hallyu from the aspect of international cooperation. The presentations during this session will also cover these topics. The first topic is Korean language education connecting the world. This looks at the possibility of the Korean wave from a linguistic perspective. The second presentation is the 20 years of the Korean wave and future cooperation. We'll discuss the past footprints of Hallyu as well as the future direction. The third presentation concerning cooperation for K-tourism and New South policy will discuss the expansion of Hallyu to tourism. Through today's session, we hope to expand cultural exchanges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Kim Dae-kwan, for your opening speech. Now, we will have the presentation session to discuss cultural cooperation based on cultural tourism and Korean wave. The first presentation is on the Korean language education, which will be provided by Jung Hee-won from the National Institute of Korean Language. Good afternoon. As introduced, I am Jung Hee-won from the National Institute of Korean Language. President Kim Dae-kwan talked about the movie Parasite and BTS popularity. As you can see, the Korean culture is so popular all around the world. And one of the areas where we have benefited the most is regarding Korean language education. Last year, I was able to meet with a person who was involved in publishing the Oxford Dictionary, and the team works on including new words in the Oxford Dictionary, and oppa and chimak are frequently used in the English-speaking cultures. And he said that chimak and oppa may be enlisted in the Oxford Dictionary very soon. So you can see that it's not only the Korean culture, but also Korean language and expressions that are being adopted globally. So today I'm going to discuss Korean language education. In September this year, the Korean government announced a 3-year plan to promote Korean language education globally. And I'm going to cover some of the points that was included in this plan. Let's first take a look at the terminology. When we think about Korean education versus Korean language education, how is it different from typical literacy education that we receive in school? Kugo and Hangugo, so these all refer to the same language that we speak. But when it's combined with education, we make differentiation between these two expressions. Korean education is provided to children who speak Korean as their native language. So it is basically literacy education. But Korean language education is the kind of education we provide for people who do not speak Korean as their native language. So this means that we provide Korean language education as Korean for second or foreign language education. Then let me look back on the history of Korean language education. In the modern sense, you can see how Korean language education began in Russia at St. Petersburg University in 1897, and in 1934 at Columbia University in the US, Korean language courses got offered. But the Department of Language Education was established in Beijing University in 1934. So I can say that the modern history of Korean language education has more than 120 years of history. In Korea, the Korean Language Institute was established within Yonsei University in 1959, and they celebrated the 60th anniversary last year. In the beginning, they only had 6 students, but now the Korean Language Institute of Yonsei University has been growing rapidly. And 10 years from then, in 1969, the Korean Language Education Center was established at the SNU, and in 1986, the Korean Language and Culture Training Center was established at Korea University. But for many decades, Korean language education was only provided for diplomats and some foreign soldiers stationed in Korea, as well as a few experts who were going to research on Korea. There was not a lot of demand for Korean language learning in the past, but recently there has been a dramatic increase in the demand for Korean language education. So overseas, 1897 was the beginning year, and in Korea it was 1959 for teaching Korean as a foreign or second language. But we have about 200 institutions that offer that, and more than 1,300 institutions overseas are offering Korean language education. But this has only been a recent development. For instance, Korean language research institutes were established mainly after the 1990s. Almost all of these centers were established after 2000. That's how Korean language education began in the past. And now let's look at the recent trend. In 1990s, there was rapid economic growth of Korea. And after the Korean War, many ethnic Koreans who were living abroad, they wanted Korean language education for their children. And after the mid-1990s, we saw an inflow of foreign workers and marriage immigrants, and foreign students were coming to Korea for study. But indeed, after 2000, there was a dramatic increase for Korean language education demand because of the popularity of Korean Wave. For instance, in Lithuania, there are only 20 ethnic Koreans in that country, but currently more than 800 people are learning Korean at the King Sejong Institute, and they were not able to accommodate all of those who wanted to learn Korean language. So I can say that there are even more people who want to learn Korean. Another interesting characteristic of these learners is that in the past, those Korean language learners were mainly experts or researchers who had to learn Korean language for their profession. But now there are more and more Korean language learners that want to improve their Korean language for their own personal interests. So you can see that there was only recently procedures and the programs were introduced. The topic began in 1997, and the Korean Language Basic Act was enacted in 2005 to provide a legal framework for Korean language education, and the King Sejong Institute began to be established in 2007. And since then, there have been some policies and support for Korean language education. Moving on to the current status, let's take a look at the status of Korean language globally. Currently, we have 50 million people in South Korea and 25 million people in North Korea who are speaking Korean as their native language. So in terms of native speaker population, Korean is number 14, and including second and foreign language speakers of Korean, we are ranked 22nd. But we expect that the demand for Korean language learning will continue to increase. Let's take a look at the trend. In 2007, King Sejong Institutes were opened in 4 countries, but this year we have 213 King Sejong Institutes in 76 countries where a lot of foreigners are learning Korean language. And you can see that the growth trend is very rapid and the angle is almost 45 degrees. It's not only the King Sejong Institute, but when you take a look at the TOPIK test takers, there has been a dramatic increase in the number of TOPIK test takers. When it began in 1997, the growth trend was very minimal, but in 2019, in just 20 years, the number of TOPIK test takers has increased to 300,000 people. So it has been a 130-fold increase. In addition, we can see the growth potential for Korean language learning. You can take a look at the Korean related majors and Korean wave clubs and tourists and other business activities that are expected to continue to grow. We have foreign workers and marriage migrants and students who are coming to Korea, and they need to learn Korean as well. I would like to say that the increase in the demand for Korean language education is very much similar to the economic growth of Korea. And this is a graph you can see. This is the growth of GDP from 1960 to 2007. And this growth trend is very similar to the growth trend of King Sejong Institute learners as well as TOPIK test takers. I can even say that the growing demand for Korean language education can be compared to the miracle on the Han River. One of my friends immigrated to the US, and she's raising her children there. And the children are in their middle school, and they arrived at Incheon International Airport. And as they were driving along the Olympic Highway, these children saw the lights in Seoul along the Han River, and they were very impressed by the landscape. When they were going to the Sunday Korean language school, they were not that impressed, but when they were actually here, they were able to see how advanced Korea is. When you think about the miracle on the Han River, you can understand that Korea was able to grow rapidly from the Korean War. So there was rapid and compressed economic growth between the Korean War and the Asian financial crisis. But I would like to also point out that there were side effects of rapid industrialization. And rapid industrialization and urbanization have led to some side effects and social problems. However, Korea was able to achieve industrialization and democratization at the same time based on mature citizenship, and that is why we're now able to hold an event like Global Korea Convention today. Likewise, there are limitations and concerns that we need to address. While there was a huge growth in Korean language education, and it has been pretty successful, we have experienced lack of systematic support and basic research for Korean language education. In the past, it was mainly a one-way promotion of Korean language, but now we need to pursue qualitative growth in Korean language education by collaborating with the local countries. This is Professor Kang Hyun-hwa, the head of the King Sejong Institute Foundation. And there was an interview recently, and she also said that we need to promote Korean language education in connection with the respective countries, and there should be more investment in basic research for Korean language education. So in this sense, in September, the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism announced a comprehensive plan to promote Korean language education. What was interesting is that in August, there was a new curriculum announced in India, and Korea was included as a second or foreign language as part of the regular curriculum. So this was reported in the media, and this is something that we need to support at the government level. Now, with the vision of connecting the world through the Korean language, 한국어, the policy objective is to offer smart, kind, and friendly Korean language education. I'd like to introduce to you some of the specific projects. First of all, we need to standardize the Korean language education curriculum. I said that we have more than 100 years of history in Korean language education. However, we have not been able to establish a conduct systematic research on standard curriculum. There has been some research effort done by the National Institute of Korean Language, and as a result, we were able to announce the standard curriculum. But this is not the end, because we need to apply the standard curriculum tailored to the local situations. Therefore, we need to implement some customization depending on the countries where Korean language education is offered. So this is something that we will continue to do. Now, here is some detail about the standard curriculum. We have level 1 all the way to level 6. In level 1, they can engage in basic conversation. In level 2, they can have some daily conversation, and all the way to level 6. There are very detailed descriptions of language capabilities and what they can do at different levels. Now, we are in the process of adding some specific details for different cultures and different language regions. And we also are going to introduce some textbook approval system. In Korea, many textbooks have been developed and teaching materials have been developed, and this was reported in the media. Then the media report says that there's no good Korean language textbook, but this is not true, because we have very good quality Korean language textbooks. But some textbooks and teaching materials include inaccurate information that may cause misunderstanding of the Korean society. And there were some teaching materials that include expressions that we no longer use. So these have to be addressed. The country, the government, has to be responsible for taking care of these aspects. Currently, we are now in the research phase. The nationally produced textbooks will be certified, but for textbooks that are published in the private sector, if they want, they will be able to get certified. But at the same time, we want to put in place a system where a thorough review of the content of teaching materials can be conducted. And finally, I want to talk about teacher education. In 2015, the Korean Language Basic Act was enacted and the certification program was introduced. And so far, 50,000 teachers have been trained and certified, but there needs to be additional professional development for these language teachers. So it's not only teacher education, but also further professional development, mainly centered on King Sejong institutes. So far, we have dispatched Korean language teachers from Korea, but we also want to work with King Sejong institutes so that local teachers can be nurtured. So that is the key objective of this project. And finally, you can see some of the cases where specific projects were carried out. And in India, the new educational curriculum was announced, and Korean was adopted as one of the foreign languages. But now, through King Sejong Institute, the National Institute of Korean Language is developing curriculum for middle school and high schools in India. These curriculum will have to be detailed and designed to cater to the local specific needs. So we're collaborating with the experts in India jointly. And we're going to offer training for Korean language teachers in India. So this is ongoing in India, but also we're going to expand this to other countries, to new Southern Policy countries as well as new Northern Policy countries. And if there's any requests, then our institute will be there to provide assistance and support. And this has been my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Next, we will go on to the presentation by Choi Ji-young from the Korea Culture and Tourism Institute concerning the achievements of the last 2 decades of the Korean Wave and future direction. Good afternoon. As have been introduced, I am Choi Ji-young of the Korea Culture and Tourism Institute. I would like to share with you the last 20 years of the Korean Wave as well as the future strategy. When we talk about cultural cooperation, we are inevitably going to talk about the Korean Wave. It's been a little over 20 years since we have talked about the Korean Wave, so let's take a look at the last 20 years, some limitations, as well as how we're going to prepare for the future. This research was conducted by the Korea Culture and Tourism Institute concerning the last 20 years of the Korean Wave. In preparing for the research, we first pondered over the concept of the Korean Wave. What is the scope of the Korean Wave? There was a lot of controversy concerning the definition of the scope. That is why we want to start from these facts. Who uses the Korean Wave, and what, how, and to what extent? So, overseas consumers are consuming K-culture, including K-drama, K-pop, and movies. And it is voluntary consumption, and it's not temporary, but it's continuous. That is what we defined as the Korean Wave in our research. If we take a look at the 20 years of the Korean Wave, we can divide the Korean Wave into different stages. We believe that we can use about 4 stages to talk about the Korean Wave. The Korean Wave started in China and Southeast Asia for the first phase, and then the second phase is Japan. The third phase is the change in the contents to K-pop, and the fourth phase is the global market represented by Parasite and BTS. And along with the 4 stages of the Korean Wave, we took a look at the different stages of the Hallyu consumers. And along with the development stage of the Korean Wave, what kind of support did the government provide for the Korean Wave? So we start with the Kim Dae-jung administration. At that time, there was the start of the Korean Wave policy. And then we see that these policies take root during the Roh Moo-hyun administration. We have the expansion of the policies during the Lee Myung-bak administration. And we did try to strengthen the Korean Wave policies during the Park Geun-hye administration, but that was met by a crisis because the government went through a crisis. But now we are going to the new leap forward for the Korean wave during the Moon Jae-in administration. Such policies are conducted by various organizations under the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. We have the Korean International Cultural Exchange Promotion Agency, the Korean Cultural Contents Agency, as well as other agencies under the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. At our research institute, we take a look at what are some of the policies that are well developed and that are still in need of development. We believe that the protection of copyright should be better developed from this chart. This is probably because we do not have enough data for that aspect, and we believe that there are still vulnerabilities in terms of infrastructure and financing. We could see that many of the organizations had well-balanced policies. On the right, we have the Korean Wave keyword clouds. We took a look at all of the policies that have been announced related to culture, and we could see that the Korean Wave and Olympic and cooperation with ASEAN have been included in these policies, showing that the Korean Wave is being used for diplomatic efforts. Let's take a look at some achievements during the last 2 decades. I'm sure that you are well aware of the achievements, and so this graph shows you a single view of the whole 20 years. Here you could see the increase of the contents exports. You can see that we have 17% increase year on year. Here you could see the contents that are leading the Korean wave, such as broadcasting, film, and music. So this is the amount that was exported in the last 20 years. In the beginning, TV dramas were leading. The red is music, and you can see that the red surpasses TV dramas. You can see that film in 2005, we did have a growth along with the TV series Winter Sonata in Japan, but after that we did not have a lot of increase, but we believe that it will take the next leap forward with Parasite. Not only do we have the export of the Korean wave contents, but we see that it also has ripple effects in other industries. For example, K-beauty is an industry that grew quite a bit due to the Korean wave, such as food. We also see K-travel. This is related to the Korean wave travel that will be presented by the third presentation. If we take a look at the K-tourism out of all tourism, it is expanding quite quickly, and the travelers based on the Korean wave are becoming an important group of travelers and tourists to Korea. We see that those who travel to Korea because of the Korean wave are usually women in their 20s and 30s. They prefer individual travel rather than package, and they spend more while they are here. And they also become the opinion leaders for future tourists. And so they are heavy users that we need to focus on for the future of tourism. Let's take a look at some social and cultural achievements. Along with economic achievements, we have social and cultural achievements. We see that there is a creation of Korean wave fandom. They actually started in China and Southeast Asia, but it has been expanded across the globe thanks to the development of digital broadcasting and ICT. We can see that because of the increase in fan groups, we have implications for other sectors. And here you can see the changes in the fan group. On the right is the number of tweets related to K-pop. You can see the start and the current situation. Fans of K-pop enjoy not only culture, but as I mentioned before, They prefer to learn the Korean language, and they become important opinion leaders to spread K-culture. And based on such fan groups, the Korean wave stars become spokespersons for famous brands around the world. These results can be commercial activities of different individuals, but at the same time, it will also be an opportunity for the Korean culture to not simply accept culture from the outside, but to become a leading culture of the world to impact other cultures. And this shows that the Korean culture is hot and trendy, and it could help us bring Korean culture into the mainstream global culture. And based on our achievements thus far, we can utilize the increasing soft power of the Korean wave, leading to political and diplomatic achievements. We have seen the growth of the Korean culture centers around the world, as well as the King Sejong Language Institutes. But there are some limitations in maintaining the Korean wave. Thus far, the Korean wave has grown based on popular culture, but there are some weaknesses within the industry itself. For example, SM, YG, and JYP are the three largest entertainment companies in Korea. But these large companies rely on a single celebrity, and when that celebrity is the sole source of that entertainment company, then if that celebrity is shaken, the whole company can be shaken. And there's also the issue of star systems. We have young celebrities becoming celebrities very young, and so there is the issue of human rights and the fact that they become a celebrity without being able to devote themselves to education. So we have the issue of human rights, as well as the fact that they become emotional laborers. So we do need government support and also compensation from the government. Without such a systematic regime, we will continue to see issues that become controversial, and that may hinder the development of the Korean wave in the future. And we see the lack of statistics related to the Korean wave. During the last 20 years, we tried to collect information and data about the Korean wave, and it's very difficult to collect such data. We believe that the accumulation of data will become our history, and it can be utilized for industrial purposes, for business purposes, and also for policy making. Building such assets is very important. We also see the lack of assets for Korean wave tourism. For example, BTS has various tours, but they do not have K-pop arenas that they can perform in Korea. We have had the development of Hallyu World and Hallyu theme parks ever since the early 2000s. We have had grand proposals, and it looked like they were well going, but there has not been any projects that have been completed up until now. When we pursue these projects and complete these projects, they can be utilized as resources for Korean wave tourism, but we have not been able to seize this opportunity. We also need to respond to the changing environment for the global cultural industry. As I mentioned before, Netflix and other digital platforms are being utilized to consume culture, and the Korean culture is taking the next leap forward based on these platforms. Based on these digital platforms, we see the growth of the global industry, and we need to take a look at how we're going to respond to these changes in the future. And we also need to deal with anti-Korean wave. Well, we could see that at times the anti-Korean wave and the hatred for Korean wave is sometimes based on politics, economics, or society. It seems that a lot of our culture is being shared around the world, and we need to now be more concerned about how we can converge our culture with other cultures. And in China, they are quite critical of the Korean culture based on their government policies to look to the north. And so, in the future, in order to have sustainable development of the Korean wave, what should be our direction? I only have 1 minute left. Well, let me just pinpoint the important aspects. Thus far, this is what I have mentioned. So during the last 20 years, the Korean wave has been led by popular culture. K-drama and K-pop have led the Korean wave, but despite so, the conversion with this content, and we have always concentrated on spreading this culture, and that has actually led to the lack of efforts to recognize the prestige of this industry. So we need to, at this point in time, think about national museums to showcase popular culture. We have had proposals for such museums, but we have not been able to implement any of the plans. So the Korean wave is becoming more well-known, and so we need to find support to embody such culture in museums. We also need to make sure that we think about the human rights of the celebrities from a qualitative perspective rather than just a quantitative perspective. We also need to build tourism infrastructure such as the K-pop arena, and we believe that such infrastructure will facilitate the spreading of K-culture to other countries around the world. And in order to respond to the changing global environment, we will need the support of the government. Last but not least, the role of the government needs to change. They should not be leading the Korean wave policies, but they should play the role of a coordinator to coordinate various Korean wave policies. And when the Korean wave continues to expand to countries around the world, we need to show that we are also respectful of the local cultures. So, based on these points, I have proposed a few projects which I will not be able to present. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for the presentation by Choi Ji-young. Our final presentation is on promoting K-tourism in the ASEAN region. It will be provided by Yoo Ji-yoon, researcher at the Korean Culture and Tourism Institute. Good afternoon. As introduced, I am Yoo Ji-yoon at the Korea Culture and Tourism Institute. Today, I am going to discuss how we can promote tourism exchanges between Korea and ASEAN countries. This is the content of my research. We have the new Southern policy, and within this framework, we zoomed in on Vietnam, the Philippines, and Singapore in order to understand their tourism environment, the market, and the consumers, so that we can draw implications for the market and directions for policies to promote tourism between Korea and these countries. First of all, there is a significance of ASEAN region as part of the new Southern policy. ASEAN region has been emerging as post-China with rapid growth, and ASEAN is number 6 in terms of economic size, and it has a large population. So it is growing rapidly globally. It is expected that the ASEAN economic growth rate is going to be twice higher than the average global economic growth rate. When you look at the 10 ASEAN member countries, in terms of GDP growth rate and economic size, Indonesia is a high growth market, and Vietnam, the Philippines, and Singapore have relatively small market in size, but they have rapid economic growth. Because Korea is located in the Asian continent, we have a strategic position and we want to reduce our reliance on G2. Therefore, we have announced our new Southern policy. So ASEAN was established several decades ago, and we began to exchange with ASEAN. In 1997, there was the Asian foreign currency crisis, and there were discussions on expanding an economic community within Asia. And together with China, Japan, we participated in the discussion with ASEAN countries. And ASEAN is now implementing the ASEAN community in order to strengthen the integration within the region. So as you can see, ASEAN is a very important region for Korea, and in November 2017, President Moon Jae-in announced a new Southern policy, and as a result, the Presidential Committee on the new Southern policy was established. And in 2019, there was the third Korea-ASEAN Special Summit meeting and the first Korea-Mekong Special Summit. The new Southern policy is based on 3 Ps: people, peace, and prosperity, in order to promote co-prosperity and peace based on people. First of all, when it comes to people, it is key to promote mutual understanding through people-to-people exchanges. And number one goal for the people side is to increase the number of tourists from ASEAN countries to Korea, and we also want to diversify sources of tourism for Korea. In this context, we have conducted this research, especially by focusing on Vietnam, the Philippines, and Singapore, which is a leading country in the ASEAN region. By conducting this research, we want to understand how we can improve and increase the inbound tourism from these 3 countries. Now, I'm going to discuss the importance of tourism markets for Vietnam, the Philippines, and Singapore. This is the mapping of the market size and the growth rate. Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand have high growth potential. However, we also can see that Vietnam and the Philippines and Indonesia have great potential, even though the market size is small. Singapore is included in the top priority group because Singapore is a large economy with very good potential. And in the middle class group, we have these countries that have large potential market, and they include Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Let's take a look at the tourism market trend for Vietnam. There was 10% growth of outbound tourism in 2018 and 13% growth in the spending of tourists. And this tendency is quite promising, and it is expected that this trend will continue going forward. Now let's take a look at the PEST analysis of Vietnam. Politically, Vietnam is attracting foreign investment, and they're promoting balanced development between the South and the North. And the economic growth rate is 7.1%, and we expect Vietnam to continue to grow at a rapid rate. And given the geopolitical situation, you can see that Vietnam is leading the ASEAN development. However, there are some economic concerns such as growing income inequality in the southern region. Socially speaking, out of 90 million population, 40% of the population is between 10 and 24 years old. So this is a young population, and the middle class is increasing with growing purchasing power, and they have high loyalty for particular brands. Let's take a look at the characteristics of tourism market in Vietnam, and there's growing tendency for tourism along with economic development. And also Vietnamese tourists are spending much more. 88% of Vietnamese tourists are going to the Asian countries. And so the top 10 tourist destinations are all Asian countries. Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and China received an increase in Vietnam tourists. 37% for Japan, 29% for Taiwan, and 21% for Korea. And thanks to low-cost carriers, there's an increasing number of Vietnamese tourists. Especially Vietjet Air has been very popular among young travelers. And they prefer to travel as packages, and they prefer short-term travel, and they love to enjoy food and shopping. Let's move on to the Philippines. 8.4% of increase in outbound and 7% in the increase in their spending. So this is a rapidly growing market. According to PEST analysis, economically speaking, the private sector spending is 70% of the GDP. So this is domestically driven market, and 60% of the GDP are in the service industry, and they have a business process outsourcing. And the money transfer from overseas workers is major driving force behind the spending. Socially speaking, they have more than 100 million population. The domestic market is quite big, and the younger population between the ages of 25 and 54 take up 40% of the population, and thanks to high birth rate, they have a large portion of children. And 3 to 5% of the top high-income classes, they prefer to spend money overseas. They have a low penetration of the internet, so they have a high penetration of the mobile network. What are the key characteristics of the Filipino tourism market? First of all, I can see that the domestic market, the domestic tourism market has been growing at a rate of 14.5% since 2010. And there's a growing recognition and appreciation of travel as their income levels increase. As for tourism destinations, there are mainly Asian countries. Korea takes up 25% of the total inbound tourism, and it's been growing at a rate of 8% for the past 5 years. And thanks to the easing of visa regulations of the Philippines, it is going to provide a momentum for the growth of Filipino tourists. Now, as low-cost carriers are traveling to the Philippines, there is an increase in the number of tourists coming from the Philippines. But one limitation or concern is that many of these aircraft seats are designated for inbound Koreans who are coming to Korea. They prefer to travel individually, and they are relatively younger in terms of age. They like to shop, but their spending is relatively less than other countries. Let's move on to Singapore. Singapore is quite different compared to the Philippines and Vietnam. Singapore is a mature market in terms of tourism. The Vietnam market and the Philippines, they are relatively young in their history for tourism, but people in Singapore have extensive experiences of overseas travel. So Singaporeans are traveling overseas most frequently, and many people from Singapore, they like to visit the same countries over and over again. And they may visit Malaysia and Indonesia and the neighboring countries for their overseas travel. So they take up about 70% of overseas travel. Singapore uses large carriers for their overseas trips. There has been an increase of 30% in terms of flights, but the market itself has been quite stagnant. They prefer to travel individually, and they prefer to visit natural sightseeing areas. Now let's take a look at the Target, resource, accessibility, value for money, e-connect, and loyalty. These are the factors that we evaluated in understanding different markets as we conducted this analysis. Please refer to this table for details in terms of target, resources, accessibility, value for money, internet and online connection, and loyalty. So please refer to the table for more information. According to our analysis on the inbound tourism, we were able to draw some policy implications for these three target markets. Vietnam and the Philippines are growing rapidly at the rate of 5 to 6%, and there have been many changes in terms of spending patterns and travel patterns. Their level of tourism may not be as high as expected, but there is a lot of growth potential. Also, there is a growing demand for online-based tourism. In Vietnam and the Philippines, the telecommunications infrastructure is relatively behind, but there is a growing demand for OTA services and global internet portal services. And in all these three countries, people enjoy online communication. So we need to build an online communication where we can promote and we can promote our tourism destinations. Hallyu is well established in these three target markets, and women in their 20s and 30s are interested in learning more about the Korean culture. For these three countries, Korea is positioned as a low-cost tourist destination. As a tourist destination, Korea is understood as a place where they can visit at low cost or low budget. Going forward, we will need to develop more high value added tourist packages and services so that we can increase the prestige of Korea as a tourist destination. With the COVID-19 pandemic, the airline industry is going through disruption. Currently, there are several airports where LCCs are not flying, but in the future, we need to put in place policies to promote the LCCs going to these different cities. And this is going to increase connectivity between Korea and ASEAN countries. As for Japan, they are very active in easing the visa regulations for ASEAN countries, and this is something that we need to learn. Compared to Japan, even though we have had increase in inbound tourists, because of the recent active easing of visa regulations in Japan, recently, the inbound tourism going to Japan is increasing much faster than that we experience in Korea. So this is something that we also need to improve. Overall, there are several directions that we need to explore. First of all, we need to promote the industry and strengthen cooperation between ASEAN and Korea. We also need to build a reciprocal relationship between the two regions. In particular, there is this image of Hallyu or Korean wave in the Southeast Asian countries. And now we need to promote the image that Korea is clean and safe, and the pandemic is well under control. And this is something that we need to promote based on wellness and MICE and health. We can make all these connections. And by making these connections, we can develop strategically high value added tourism products and services so that we can go beyond the limitations of Korea being positioned as a cheap place to visit. And for the other responses, please refer to the slides. And with this, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much,
세 분의
Ms.
발표가 모두 끝났습니다.
Yoo Ji-yoon, for your presentation. We have heard 3 presentations. We would now like to invite President Kim Dae-won to moderate the discussion session, inviting the 3 presenters with 3 discussants. We would like to invite the moderator, 3 presenters, and 3 discussants to join us on stage. The discussion will be conducted by Team Leader Lee Shin-young of CJEMC. We also have with us Mr. Kang Kyu-sang of the Korea Tourism Organization and Mr. Chang Hyang-sil, professor at Sangju University.
예, 안녕하십니까. 한국문화관광연구원 원장 김대관입니다.
Good afternoon. I'm Kim Dae-kwan of the Korea Culture and Tourism Institute. We have been allocated 40 minutes for discussion. I'm sure that there is much to discuss, but given the time constraint, I do believe that we need to organize our discussion. To each of our discussants, we will be providing 7 to 10 minutes each. And after we have heard from the discussants, we will go back to the presenters to either answer the questions that may come up or add to your presentations. We were not able to invite a discussant for the Korean language, so we would go back to Ms. Chung Hee-won afterwards so that she can add to our presentation. We will start with Lee Sun-young of CJENM, and then we'll go to Mr. Kang Kyu-sang of the Korea Tourism Organization. Lee Sun-young is working at the Convention Department of the CJENM. CJENM is well known as a company that promotes Korean culture overseas, making great contributions. Dr. Choi Ji-young's presentation on the last 20 years of the Korean wave will be discussed based on the experience of CJ. And please also mention your presentation concerning your discussion concerning the Korean wave. You have the floor. Good afternoon. As I've been introduced, I am Lee Sun-young. Well, Dr. Choi has presented the last 20 years of the Korean wave, particularly the achievements, and we believe that it was a very meaningful research that was conducted. CJENM has conducted Korean wave businesses continuously, and so concerning the presentation that you have presented, I would like to speak from a corporate perspective, how we have conducted the Korean wave businesses, what kind of results that we have had. And we have had 8 years of business related to KCON, and how have we grown that business. I would like to share some examples with you. And I believe that it would complement the presentation by Dr. Choi. Well, I would like to talk about the KCON project. The KCON project is bringing together various aspects of concerts. For example, it's a different twist on concerts. KCON has the Korean wave at the center of our concert, and we also have various programs related to K-culture. So it's more of a festival rather than a concert. K-pop stars, they have concerts all over the world, and these concerts are not just simple concerts, but it would be a festival to bring together all people who are interested in K-culture so that they can interact with each other and enjoy various programs. We have started this project in the US in 2012, so it's been about 8 years, and we have conducted these programs in 8 different countries, and the accumulated visitors is about 1.1 million people. We have seen the growth of KCON during the last 8 years, but as you're well aware, because of COVID-19, we were not able to conduct any of the offline events that we had planned. But we actually transformed them to online events, and under the name of K-Contact, we have conducted K-culture festivals in February and June. Each of the festivals lasted for about 6 to 7 days. So these were offline events that were transformed into online events. And as a result, from 150 countries, people participated in these programs, and on the average, 5 million people viewed these events. So for the last 7 years, we have been able to invite 1.1 million visitors to our festivals, but you can see that a five-fold of them, 5 million people, have participated in the online events. We have conducted KCON for a very long time, and we have been able to grow this event because of 2 reasons. There are 2 important reasons why we have been able to grow KCON. First, K-pop started as a simple genre of music, and that was expanded to TV drama, film, food, cosmetics, and other industries. I think that is one important point. So if you actually go to the site of these festivals, K-pop is the core content, but people can enjoy various events with other relevant industries such as K-food, K-film, and K-TV drama. So you can see that K-pop is being expanded to other industries. And it's not a simple festival, but it is an opportunity to introduce relevant industries. So it's becoming a platform for other industries to find their audience. And we see that there is the power of these festivals to grow and change. These festivals have been structured in that specific way. We are not providing all of the contents. If we had provided all of the contents, then it would have been very difficult to continue the growth of our festivals. But because we provided a platform, it had the power to grow. Second is related to engagement. So it's not about having a simple concerts where the artists stand on stage to deliver the contents, but it's a way of the K-pop stars to meet the fans. So we have more opportunities for engagement compared to standard concerts. And we also see community activities by fans through panel sessions and workshops. The fans, they create their own communities. They are able to find the sense of belonging to a community. And they are able to see that they are not the only ones enjoying this culture. They can become more confident about enjoying this culture because they see other people enjoying this culture. And so we can see that fans are able to mature through these communities. Concerning various policies, we have heard about sustainability, and many proposals were made by Dr. Che. But as someone in practice,
전개하면서
I would like to
조금
share
지원이나 그런
some
것들을 받았으면 좋겠다고
points
생각하는
that
부분들을 좀 정리해
we
보면요.
would like to be supported on.
우선 말씀해 주신 것처럼
But
그
as you
빅데이터
have
같은 것들이 좀
mentioned,
있었으면
we would like to
좋겠다는
see
부분을
big
하고
data.
있습니다. 저희가 새로운 지역에 들어갈
If we
때
want to
그
move
지역과
into a new
관련된 여러 가지
market,
정보가 상당히
we
부족한
lack
케이스가 많이
information
있습니다.
and
그래서
data about
저희
that
나름대로
specific
여러
area
가지
in
지표들과
most
자료들을
cases.
활용해서
So we try to
그
use
지역의
as
관련
many
사업성
indicators
이미지를
as
확인하기
possible
위해서
to
굉장히 노력하고
test
있는데
the
그런
marketability of
것들이
that
조금
region.
더 체계적으로 좀
But if we
있었으면
were to
좋겠고
have
좀 더
systematic data,
디테일하게
that would be
들어가자면
great.
그 지역의
In more
어떤 문화적인
detail,
트렌드라든지
we would like
지역
information
내
about
관련 사업,
cultural
관련
consumption
사업들이 어느
trends,
정도
as
진행되고
well
있는지에
as the
대한 정보가 좀
maturity
있으면
of
저희가 그 지역을 파악하고
performance
정확히
and
들어가는 데
concert
있어서 굉장히
markets.
도움이 될 것
That would
같습니다.
be greatly helpful.
그리고 제가 알기로 이제 각종
To the best of my
정보와
knowledge,
관련돼서 한국
related
문화원이라든지
to
각
various
지역
data,
내에서 계시는 분들이
the
이제
Korea Cultural
한류와 관련된
Centers,
사업들을 많이
they
하시는데
have various
그 사업과
Korean wave
관련돼서 어떤
projects.
결과라든지 성과에 대해서 좀
But I don't
공유를
think
같이
there
해야
is
그런
active
것들을 좀
sharing
파악할 수 있는
about the results of such projects. So we would like to see a channel to share the results of Korean wave projects by Korean cultural centers. Of course, it's good to see the numbers, but if we could hear from those who actually participated in these projects, it would be very helpful. Because we have large-scale projects, we sometimes wish that we could have administrative support. And because we are in business, tax is always a big issue. So we would like advisory or consulting concerning taxes.
그래서 이제 뭐 저희가 뭐 세액 공제라든지 이런 부분도
And also concerning tax benefits, I think we see that we have very low tax benefits compared to other countries. And sometimes tax benefits do not apply to income that has been raised overseas. And so we would like to see improvements on these fronts. If we have such support, then we would be able to make bold decisions concerning the business and have a more sustainable business in the future. Having listened to Dr. Che's presentation, I shared with you some of the ideas that came to my mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You made very important comments, especially from the perspective of business, how to promote Korean Wave.
And the support that you would like from the public sector. The Korea Culture and Tourism Institute and the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism surely needs to discuss these requests for support, and our institute will definitely discuss these issues.
Let's move on to the second discussant that is going to discuss tourism trends in a particular region. It is where most Koreans visit, and we also have a large inbound tourism from this region, Southeast Asia. So I'd like to invite team leader Chang Gyu-sang for his discussion. Hello. As introduced, I am Kang Gyu-sang, I am the team head of the Southeast Asian region at the Korea Tourism Organization. In this session, we're discussing Korean Wave and New Southern Policy and tourism promotion. This is exactly what Korea Tourism Organization is doing. So I'm very happy that we are part of the session. Culture and tourism and Korean Wave, these are all very important in promoting tourism. In my presentation, in my discussion, I'm going to discuss what we've been experiencing, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, and some points that I want to make. Ms. Yoo Ji-yoon gave a wonderful presentation. I was able to learn a lot, but now we're going through an unprecedented global challenge of COVID-19. This has been huge disruption. Now, we all need to develop new strategies and we need to think about what to do next. But still, the New Southern Policy region or the Southeast Asian region is really important for all of us. In the presentation, she mentioned that Korea is positioned as a country where low-budget travelers can visit. I'd like to make some comments about that. There may be several reasons why, and I have not made an analysis myself, But when you think about Singapore, the Philippines, or Vietnam, people in these countries may travel to other Asian countries, and they may compare their experiences in other countries with Korea. And Korea, they may think that prices in Korea are quite high and expensive, but I think that we need to improve the quality of tourism experiences rather than pursuing a quantitative growth as we are going through the pandemic. We may not be able to switch our direction overnight, but I believe that we need to put more focus on improving the image and the brand and the prestige of Korea so that Korea can be positioned as a premium tourist destination. Of course, among Korean Wave fans, those in the late teens and early 20s, they may not have a lot of purchasing power, but these are the young people who are interested in Korean culture and they have high loyalty to the Korean culture. But I wonder how many of these Korean Wave fans can come to Korea. So this is a big question. Then we may also need to be able to appeal to those who have the purchasing power so that they can come to Korea and visit here and also spend their money while traveling in Korea. So this is something that we need to do. We need to upgrade the position of Korea so that Korea can be differentiated from other Southeast Asian countries where they can easily go and at low budget. In the presentation, Singapore was mentioned. And in a recent survey in Singapore, 40% of the respondents said that they would love to go to Korea when the pandemic is over. When travels resume after the pandemic, I expect that there will be more tourists coming from Singapore and other countries, and we need to develop new strategies. There are some news reports about Singapore and Hong Kong offering the COVID bubbles for tourists. There will be many obstacles and hurdles that we may encounter, and there may be price hikes. But then we need to identify which countries can send tourists to Korea. And by identifying our target audiences, we need to develop strategies specifically for each of these countries. Recently, at Gyeongbok Palace, BTS performed a wonderful concert, and this is what you may think. BTS is globally very popular, and they received awards in the US. What is the direct impact of BTS popularity on Korean tourism? This may be a research question or a topic that you may be interested in. Let me share with you a recent case. There is a guide tour program in Gyeongbok Palace, and 700 students from Canada purchased the online tour for Gyeongbok Palace. This was very encouraging because BTS had performance at Gyeongbok Palace. It was reported globally. And thanks to this, these Canadian students were able to sign up for the online virtual tour of Gyeongbok Palace. And there, the teachers were happy that the Gyeongbokgung Palace is a historic site, and there are valuable lessons that students can learn. I believe that was one of the reasons why they decided to purchase this tour program. Be it the Korean Wave or the Korean language education, there are other cultural contents we can utilize to attract foreign tourists. And this is what the Korean tourism promotion activities we've been doing. And in Dubai, there was an interesting experiment that we conducted. In the Middle East, in Dubai, there are people who would compare the European countries with Korea. Traveling or flying to Europe is cheaper than flying all the way to Korea from Dubai. Of course, there are people who have loyalty to the Korean wave and those who are very much in favor of Korea. But in general, most travelers may consider the cost aspect because the flights to Korea are much more expensive than flights to Europe. But when there was a theme of cherry blossoms in Korea was introduced, and when these beautiful landscape or nature was promoted, then we were able to see that people in the 30s and 40s and 50s, they would love to visit Korea. But for the middle-aged men in their 40s and 50s, they didn't really have much loyalty towards Korea previously, but visiting places full of cherry blossoms was something that they always desired. But going all the way to Japan was more expensive, and it was not easy for them to do so. Now, we saw that there was a niche, and we promoted Korea as a destination for them to go and enjoy the cherry blossoms in the spring, and we promoted the merits and benefits of visiting Korea instead of Japan for cherry blossom experiences. So that was quite successful in appealing to these people in Dubai. Likewise, for Southeast Asian travelers, we can continue to position Korea as a premium tourist destination. While there are low-cost options such as LLCs, we also need to promote Korea as a quality tourist destination for those who are able to spend more. While we're going through the pandemic, I think that we need to spend this time in building up our infrastructure and developing tourist programs and other promotional activities. Then I believe that we can appeal to broader traveler base so that we can target different groups, not only those who love K-Wave, but also other tourists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you have experience on site, you have been able to share your experience with us. Thank you very much. We will need to conduct discussions concerning the Korean language. So let us go back to Dr. Chung Hee-won, and would you like to add to your presentation on the cultural power of the Korean language?
Thank you. I've been working in this field for the past 20 years. I talked about the quantitative growth, but when it comes to Korean language teacher education, the recognition has been changed. According to the Korean Language Basic Act, now we have teacher certification program. Up until then, there was not enough understanding about the competency of Korean language teachers. And people would think that, oh, I speak Korean, I'm a native speaker of Korean, so I can teach Korean. So that was the previous perception. And in the past, there were many Korean language teachers who used to have a different career, but would have become the Korean language teachers by chance. And there were many pedagogical issues. And they may also apply some of the old style teaching methods, and some of the awkward expressions were taught. But now, for the past 15 years, there's been an increase in recognition for the need to have specially trained Korean language teachers. And we now have an understanding that teacher certification is needed for Korean language teachers. Now, when the King Sejong Institute Foundation decided to train Korean language teachers, there was a good support. And there are now many Korean language teachers who are certified and properly trained. And also in China, there are many academic society activities involving Korean language education. And I once visited one of these academic conferences, and I was quite impressed by the quality of papers and presentations there on Korean language education. So I can see that there is a good local basis for Korean language education. During the presentation about K-Wave, there were teaching materials that were developed at Korean University of Foreign Studies regarding BTS. And we all want to develop teaching materials that are based on Korean Wave so that we can appeal to those who love Korean culture. I remember learning English by watching American drama such as Friends. Likewise, there are people who love Korean culture, and there are people who are out there who want to learn the Korean language by using the Korean songs and lyrics. But unfortunately, some of these lyrics contain some vulgar words or not improper words. But still, I believe that there are many different ways we can utilize the Korean culture content, K-Wave content, in developing teaching materials. Thank you.
Thank you. The linguistic features of K-pop, and there could be difficulties in incorporating K-pop into language education, but there's also room for utilization. We have had Mr. Lee Sun-hyung speak about Dr. Che's presentation, so maybe we can go back to Dr. Che for any additional comments. Well, CJ is conducting K-cons, and K-cons have a long history, and we have seen the development of K-con. And we always realize that it must have been very difficult to start this program from a private company, and we applaud you for your efforts. Such a model has been attempted by other government organizations such as KOTRA. But because K-con already has its history, it's very difficult to start something new without that history and take root. So K-con is an opportunity to showcase Korean culture and also to have various exchanges. And that would be an opportunity to converge various cultures with K-pop, and it's something that is very difficult for the government to do. I look forward to the continuous development of K-con, and you talked about the necessity of big data, and many other people have mentioned this to me. Well, conducting research, we see that the need for K-pop has been mentioned already 10 years ago, and we see that some projects did start, but they were not continued to provide enough of a big data. So since many people are asking for big data, we now see the necessity for accumulation of data, because we know that the accumulation of data will be essential information for people working on site, and it could also be an archive for the fans to learn about Korean culture. And what is more important is that it could become the written history of our popular culture. If we miss this, then it would be very difficult to build a museum in the future to show how our popular culture developed. And so we would not have any contents for the museums to be built in the future. So we will need to start this business as soon as possible. We will need the private sector to conduct such business with the support of the government. And I think we need to be true to the fundamentals.
Thank you very much. Any other comments about regulatory support or any other regulations that need to be changed regarding taxation or other support from the government?
Well, tax benefits, we do provide tax benefits, although the support is quite fragmented. Well, I did conduct tax benefit topic last year in my research. And I think many people have questions on what kind of tax benefits exist. And so, concerning what benefits are available and how they can be applied should be brought into a single manual, I think, so that this information can be shared easily. And we need to also expand as much tax benefits as possible for the cultural industry. We will research this. Yes, thank you very much. Companies including CJ, E&M have various needs. From the government perspective, we need to also verify the policy effect. And so I believe that mutual trust based on the sharing of data is necessary. That is the only way for us to look into what has been effective for the people and for the national growth, as well as the spreading of the Korean wave. And I think our institute should research these topics.
Finally, I am going to invite the third presenter who discussed Korean wave and Korean tourism. You may not only add additional comments about your presentation, but also respond to the comments made by Kang Kyu-sang. Mr. Kang Kyu-sang made some very important comments about the practical aspects of tourism promotion, especially when it comes to the issues of value for money. Korea has been recognized as a place where there's low value for money, but this is something that we need to turn it into a momentum opportunity to drive up the image of Korea as a premium destination. So this is something very important, and I agree with what he said. I believe that we need a two-track strategy. On one part, we have to promote Korea as a place for value for money and also heart for money. The Southeast Asian population is very young and they love Korean culture. And Southeast Asian tourists who are coming to Korea are relatively young and they have desire for Korean culture and they love shopping in Korea and they also want to stay in nice and clean accommodations. But when it comes to satisfying these needs, there is some lack in terms of how we've been satisfying their needs. So I believe that we need to promote and have guest houses and other accommodations that are affordable but safe and clean. So this is something that we can promote and support with our policy. Also, as we're discussing in the session, we talk about the Korean wave, and we need to offer and increase more connectivity with the Korean wave. A lot of people understand Korea as a country of BTS, but where can they go at the airport or at the railway station or at many contact points? We should be able to make sure that they can be exposed to BTS or K-culture related products and services. In other words, I believe that we need to increase contact points for Korean wave at many different locations and places, because many of these people from Southeast Asia come to Korea to enjoy Korean culture and Korean popular culture. So we need to increase such contact points. So that's one track. And the other track is promoting Korea as a premium destination. Now, with this COVID-19 pandemic, there is a growing recognition of Korea as a country where excellent health system is in place, and Korea has been successful in responding to COVID-19. Now we're aiming for the post-pandemic era. Now, when the pandemic is over, which countries would they want to visit? Korea is usually one of the top 3 countries where they want to visit because they want to visit a safe country, they want to send their children to a safe place. In that sense, as we continue to promote the image of Korea as a clean and safe country, this is going to help us ride along this current trend. We have excellent disease control systems and measures in place, and we have a good healthcare system, and we can make connections with these strengths and attributes that we have. So by connecting tourism with healthcare and disease control, we can promote Korea as a place for wellness. Wellness or well-being is a balance between the mind and the body. In the past, health was mainly focused on physical health, and medical care was focused on treating the diseases. But now, wellness and well-being is more about promoting integrated well-being and welfare of individuals. So it is about providing preventive care before any disease happens. And if we can integrate that and connect that to tourism, this is going to be very successful. And already there are demands and needs for such services in the market. Since 4 years ago, the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism has been designating wellness tourist destinations, but these were mainly focused on the domestic tourism. And we still have a long way to go before we can position ourselves as the destination for well-being for inbound tourists. But I believe that the pandemic is a good opportunity for us to do so. More than half of the Korean population have experienced the COVID blue, and that's also the case for other countries. Many people are concerned about their mental health and well-being, and we can promote that Korea is a place where they can come and be healed. And we can also emphasize on the preventive medical care that we can provide to inbound tourists for their integrated well-being. We have excellent medical and healthcare resources. They can lead to high value-added tourism. In other countries, there are well-being focused resorts that are much more expensive than ordinary resorts. And wealthy people may travel to other countries for healing and for well-being and to recover their health and recover their beauty. So these are the global trends for high value-added travelers. In that sense, I hope that Korea will pursue this two-track approach while we tap into increasing value for money for low-budget travelers and positioning Korea as a premium destination. In addition, Vietnam and the Philippines, they speak languages, minority languages. So compared to Japan or China, we don't have language support for these travelers coming from Southeast Asia. I hope that we will also improve in this area so that we can offer better services for these travelers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for mentioning the overview of this topic and proposing some alternatives. We are here at the fourth session of the Global Korea Convention 2020. The overall topic for the convention is Korea, a leading country contributing to peace, prosperity, and sustainable development. Our topic is the expansion of cultural cooperation based on culture, tourism, and the Korean wave. Peace, co-prosperity, sustainability, these are keywords that we have already discussed today. Dr. Yoo Ji-eun talked about the 3 Ps for the new Southern policy: people, peace, and prosperity. When we conduct cultural cooperation, when we talk about peace and sustainability, it's not just about Koreans, but it's about people around the world. We are all equal, and we need to achieve peace and prosperity together. Through culture, we have that hope and responsibility to achieve peace and prosperity through culture. Thank you very much for joining us today via our online and offline platforms. We will now turn the microphone back to our MC. Thank you very much President Kim Dae-kwan, for moderating the session. Thank you to the presenters and discussants. We would like to ask you to remain seated until the very end. We would now like to invite Mr. Park Chan-wook of the Korea Culture and Tourism Institute for his closing remarks. Good afternoon. As I've been introduced, I am Park Chan-wook of the Korea Culture and Tourism Institute. To foreigners, when we ask them, why do you enjoy Korean contents? They don't say that they like Korea. They usually say they like the song, they like the movie. And their interest for contents and stars will then expand to the Korean language and traveling to Korea as well as Korean products. This means that the Korean wave is not only unique to Korea, but it also has elements that is universally attractive to people around the world. Without this universal appeal, I don't think we can explain the popularity of the Korean wave. And so the Korean wave is the new thing to enjoy for people around the world. I do believe that we need to cooperate based on this understanding. We usually had the cultural waves starting from the West, but the Korean wave enables us to talk about the cultural wave from the East. The US was the representative culture in the past, but now we see that Asian culture can also be facilitated through the Korean wave. We look forward to various systems to facilitate co-investments into the Korean culture, and so we would need vehicles for investments. Other than that, thus far we have always concentrated on creating contents and producing contents in Korea, but we hope that we can create contents from around Asia together. Non-face-to-face businesses are growing rapidly due to COVID-19, and so Netflix and other global OTTs are coming into the Korean market, which is of concern to some people. And so I do believe that we need to view foreign OTTs as partners for co-growth. And so maybe we can look into ways to partner with OTTs to move into other markets. Many people mentioned tourism. For example, we see tourism expanding because of Hollywood in the US. So we need to think of some infrastructure that can facilitate Korean wave-based tourism. Thank you very much for your participation. I am glad that we were able to host this session. We look forward to future opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Center Director Park Chan-wook, for your words. With this, let us conclude the session on promoting cultural cooperation based on cultural tourism and the Korean wave. You can watch the session again on the YouTube later on. Thank you very much for your participation.